clinical and investigations. Dr. Divya Jain would be speaking on this. She has done her MBBS from Osmania Medical College, Hyderabad, and PG from the prestigious RP Center. Then Dr. Neelu Mundada will be speaking on basic principles of management, non-surgical and surgical. Dr. Neelu Mundada has done her UG from GMC and PG from GMC Bhopal and fellowship from Arvind Eye Institute. Then I would be speaking on, we would be discussing this topic on a case-based approach. So I would be talking on case-based approach to management of third nerve palsy.
Yeah, I get it. Okay.
Then we have Dr. Varsha Pandey, and senior, very experienced strabismologist from Nagpur. She has done her UG and PG from GMC Nagpur and fellowship from Aligarh. Then the last topic would be management of sixth nerve palsy by Dr. Rishikesh Mai. He has done his undergraduation from Sion Medical College, PG and fellowship from the prestigious Shankar Nethralaya. And he is an executive member of Strabismus Society and Pediatric Ophthalmology Society of India. So we start with our first talk on, and then we have some time for the question answers. Please look into the chat box. If it's pertaining to your talk, please answer the queries which are coming on the chat box. So I request Dr. Divya Jain to start her talk, and the time would be 8 minutes. Please do not exceed your time. So Dr. Divya.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope my screen is visible to all.
Yes, make it full screen, Divya.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning to everyone. A warm welcome to all the attendees for our instruction course on a case-based approach to paralytic strabismus. I, Divya Jain, will be taking you through the basic principles of diagnosis in paralytic squints, including the clinical features and the investigations. So a pertinent beginning in any case discussion of paralytic squint is to start with the extraocular muscles. So here come the extraocular muscles and anterior view of the right eye, with the superior rectus, which is a primary elevator being supplied by the cranial nerve 3, the superior oblique, which is a primary intortor supplied by cranial nerve 4, the medial rectus and the inferior rectus and the inferior oblique all supplied by cranial nerve 3, being an adductor, a depressor, and an extortor.
Moving. The slides are not moving.
Yes, ma'am. And the lateral rectus, which is an abductor supplied by cranial nerve 6. Another salient concept in the topic of paralytic strabismus is that of the spiral of Tillot. So it's a spiral which is formed by the insertion of the recti at varying distances from the limbus, the closest being that of the medial rectus and the farthest of the superior rectus. So the applied aspect of the spiral of Tillot is seen in transposition surgeries, where the muscles need to be transposed along this spiral.
Divya?
Yes, ma'am.
Slides are not moving. We are just seeing the first slide.
Oh, okay.
You have not made it full screen also.
Yes, ma'am. You're not able to see the full screen?
No.
Okay. I'll just reshare, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah, now it is full screen.
Now it is visible.
Now can you see the next?
Yes, the slides are moving. Yeah.
Okay. So we've already discussed the extraocular muscles and the spiral of Tillot.
Yes.
Now coming to the Sherrington's and Herring's law, these are again an important concept in squint and more so in paralytic squint. So the Sherrington's law states that for any ocular movement, the direct antagonist receives an equal and simultaneous inhibition of innervation. So for example, if the right LR is being innervated, the right medial rectus is equally inhibited. And the Herring's law here states that for a binocular movement, the corresponding yoke muscle receives an equal and simultaneous innervation. So here the right lateral rectus being the agonist, the left medial rectus is the yoke muscle, which receives a simultaneous innervation. Now, a few terms which everyone needs to know. In case of paralytic squint is the agonist, which is the primary muscle here. The synergist is the muscle in the same eye, which moves the eye in the same direction. The antagonist is a muscle in the same eye, which moves the eye in an opposite direction. And the yoke muscle is a muscle in the opposite eye, which accomplishes versions in the same gaze position as that of the agonist. So to explain the yoke muscle, like for example, if we take the right lateral rectus, the left medial rectus is its yoke muscle. Now coming to classification of paralytic squint, it could be neurogenic and myogenic. In neurogenic, it could be at different positions. So it could be supranuclear, it could be nuclear, or it could be fascicular or intranuclear. And myogenic squints could be at the nerve muscle junction or the muscle per se, which are involved. Could be like hypoplasia of the muscle or a disinsertion because of trauma, etc. Now, what are the clinical characteristics which are common to paralytic squints? Incomitance. Incomitance is a difference in the deviation and different positions of gaze. A limitation of movement, which is obvious, and a difference in the primary and secondary deviation. So the primary deviation is where the person is fixing with the normal or the unaffected eye. And the secondary deviation is when the person is fixing with the paretic eye. So the secondary deviation in paralytic or incomitant squints is always larger than the primary deviation. Now coming to the stages of paralytic squint, the first stage is the paresis of the particular muscle. Let's take for example, the lateral rectus in this case. The second stage is the overaction of the ipsilateral antagonist. The same eye is medial rectus in this case. And the third stage is an underaction of the antagonist of the contralateral synergist. So the antagonist of the contralateral synergist in this case is the other eye's lateral rectus, where there is a secondary palsy of the lateral rectus called an inhibitional palsy. But how can we differentiate the inhibitional palsy from the primary? Is by covering the affected eye for some time, and we see that the other eye or the unaffected eye takes full excursion in the adductions. Now, few symptoms which patients with paralytic squints present with are diplopia. So it's binocular diplopia, could be horizontal or vertical depending on which muscle or nerve is involved. A head posture, which is a sensory adaptation to the acute onset squint. A past pointing, where the patient says that yes, the patient overshoots objects when they try to reach for something. There could be associated neurological findings like a raised intracranial tension or a space occupying lesion. And systemic disease, which we always ask for vascular causes like diabetes mellitus and hypertension in cases with neurological involvement. Now, here are a couple of tests which were done in cases of paralytic squint. So a cover test. This is how they clinically present: the third nerve with a ptosis and the eye being down and out. The fourth nerve with a head tilt, and the typical Parkes-Bialchowski three-step test being positive, where the deviation in the primary gaze, in the right and left gazes, and the right and left head tilts is noted. And in case of a sixth nerve, there is an esotropia in the affected eye. And in case of myasthenia gravis, we have the patient presenting with ptosis, which improves after an IcePack test in the clinic. Past pointing is another sign which can be elicited in the clinic, but let it be noted that this is positive only in cases of acute onset squints. So a septum is placed between the eye and hand to prevent visual feedback, and the person is asked to point towards an object, in this case, a pen's nib, for example, and the patient overshoots the pen's nib. This is because an excessive innervation is given to the affected eye because of the paretic muscle. Diplopia charting is another test which is done commonly in paralytic squints. So with the help of red-green glasses, we dissociate the eyes, and the patient is asked to overlap the images between the two eyes. So we see in this case, the lateral rectus is involved here, and the maximum separation between the two images of the right and the left eye is seen in the left gaze. Now, screen tests for paralytic squints. So these are important tests which are done. They are basically tests which are used to document the relative incomitance of the squints, underactions, overactions of the yoke muscles of the two eyes, etc. The excursions of the fellow eye are charted as the fixating eye is made to fixate in different gaze positions. So the first design over here is that of the head screen, which is the earliest screen test which was done in paralytic squints. Here the eyes are dissociated using the red-green glasses, and the outer square of 16 dots has an excursion of 30 degrees, and an inner square from the central 0 point has an excursion of 15 degrees, and the pointer is used to mark the patient's positions of different gazes. Yeah, just 1 minute. and the excursions are noted. Similarly, the screen test here, which does not require any color vision or dissociation by red green glasses, is the Lee screen, where a mirror is used to separate the two eyes. This is the Lancaster screen, which again uses red green glasses, but it can also be used to document torsion. Torsion testing is another test which is applicable in cases of oblique involvement. So subjective torsion testing by the double Maddox straw, and the objective torsion testing by fundus examination and by Humphrey visual fields. Force duction test and active force generation tests are also done. The force duction test is used to document the restrictive component in a squint, and the active force generation test is done to document the strength of the extraocular muscle, whether it is a paresis or a paralysis, which is a partial or a complete involvement of the muscle, and the management is based on these findings. Binocular visual fields are another important test, where the normal binocular fields of fixation, these are normal binocular fields, and here we can mark the diplopia free and the diplopia field, and these are used to document progression in the paralytic squints. Saccadic velocity recordings, the movements of the eye are recorded. Normal saccades are 200 to 700 degrees per second, but in paralytic squints, the patient has relatively lower saccades. And neuroimaging, an MRI or a CT scan could be done.
What happened?
I'm unable to hear.
Your screen sharing. Where I am?
Hello?
Yeah, I think.
Am I
Neelu.
audible?
Yes. Neelu, you can start your talk. Divya spoke well. Now, Neelu can start her talk.
Did Divya stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, we can see your slides.
We can see your screen.
Full screen.
Neelu.
Okay.
And start.
Make it full screen.
Yes, just getting it. Full
Yeah.
screen.
It's not full screen yet.
Yes, ma'am. Doing it. Now
you-
full screen, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes,
Good
yes,
morning.
Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bhavi ma'am. Thank you, Boss Scientific Committee, Moss Scientific Committee, for giving me this opportunity. I will be talking about the basic principle of management of paralytic squint. Paralytic, as we know, it can be neurogenic or myogenic. Neurogenic is what we are talking about today. One should know about the causes of the neurogenic paralysis. It can be congenital, inflammatory, secondary to meningitis, syphilis, infective, secondary to the cavernous sinus and orbital infections, demyelinating like multiple sclerosis, vascular, secondary to the hypertension, diabetic, aneurysm, or atherosclerotic changes. It can be traumatic or lesion because of the neoplasm, and rarely toxic. The prime management, it depends upon knowing your patient well. So you should take a proper detailed history regarding when it has started, the duration, since how long it is associated with systemic illness, preceding illness, past history of trauma or malignancy, and associated neurological diseases. A meticulous examination has to be done with special emphasis on the pupillary reaction, the fundus to rule out papillar edema, look for torsion to a corneal sensation. Detailed strabismus evaluation need to be done so as to see which muscles are involved, what are the state of the muscles, and in which sequelae the paralytic state is there. Battery of tests are needed to know the underlying cause of the paresis, and a supportive radiological investigation has to be done. The management is multidisciplinary. Along with ophthalmologists, we have to take consultation with the concerned physician, neurologist, at times with the oncologist, neurosurgeon, or ENT surgeon. It basically depends in which phase the patient is coming to us, whether he is in acute phase or chronic phase. In early phase, when the paralysis has just started, the main treatment is directed towards the underlying cause, and the treatment is started so as to revive the patient as early as possible. followed by a supportive treatment in the form of vitamin B12, systemic steroids as and when needed. The diplopia has to be minimized, and we try to minimize the sequelae of the paralysis. In chronic phase, we mainly deal with the diplopia. So it can be done in the form of a surgical or a non-surgical form. Non-surgically, one can use the images with the help of prism or can use botulinum toxin. Simpler way is to eliminate the second image with the help of occluders or patches. There are various forms of occluders. It can be used for the paralytic eye or the non-paralytic eye. Better used for the non-paralytic eye, the occlusion. So still the paralytic eye gets an initiation to keep on moving. Prisms, they play an important role, especially in cases of small amount of deviation. Diplopia, when it is in particular case, it is also useful post-operatively for residual squint. We know how the prisms they act. How do we prescribe prisms? It is given with the base in the direction opposite to the deviation. The amount is required is the minimal amount that allow a binocular single vision and that allows fusion. It can be given either as ground-in prisms or Fresnel's prisms. The ground-in prisms, when given, has to be divided in both of the eyes equally. The advantages are it gives a better visual acuity and a better costness. However, since they are heavy and expensive, we cannot use larger amount of the prism diopters into the lenses. Making also takes time. On the other hand, the Fresnel's prisms have an advantage that they are very thin, around 1 to 2 millimeter, lightweight, and larger amount of prism diopters can be used. It's also useful in cases when the deviation is changing. It can be given in a sectoral form also. Disadvantage with it is they are seen cosmetically. They create distortion and chromatic aberrations, reduce the vision, and they degenerate over a period of time. Botox injection has been used for the antagonistic muscle to the paralytic muscle. It is a neurotoxin which blocks the acetylcholine release. The dose of the Botox, it depends upon the age, the magnitude of the deviation, the muscle which we are injecting, and presence of associated fibrosis. It's basically used in individuals who require rapid recovery, those who need psychosocial gains, in cases of severe limitation of the motility or in case of larger deviation. It's more useful in cases when we are planning to do more than two muscle surgeries, like transposition surgeries, and in presence of significant antagonist contraction or orbital fibrosis. To enhance the effect of transposition, the Botox is given to the contracted muscle. It has a role in cases when the patient is unfit or does not want to undergo surgery. These are the doses for the Botox. For the recti, we can use up to 3 to 5 unit international unit. For the vertical, the doses is little bit less, and depending upon the deviation, it can be from 2.5 to 5 units. In cases when there is associated fibrosis, up to 10 international units can also be used. Advantage of Botox is that it relieves the double vision, prevents contraction, and it can be used with the transposition procedure. The disadvantage, it is short acting, can cause ptosis, and is costly. Does Botox injection improves the outcome or recovery? So this is a study that I like to share, published in JAPOS, where it says that in cases of diabetic and vascular origin, the long-term difference between the Botox injected and those who were not injected, it was same. However, in cases with severe paresis of the traumatic origin, where the recovery is delayed and contraction of the MR progresses, Botox helps the lateral rectus to recover faster. So Botox as such in it's mainly in those, in vascular, it may not be that advantage, but in traumatic, it is advantage. Now the surgical treatment, the main aim is to obtain a diplopia-free field, achieve symmetrical ocular motility, and correct abnormal head posture when it is possible. We follow 3 fundamental principles. First is to improve the ocular movement. Second is to balance the yoke muscle by creating a matching weakness in the other eye and to minimize the creation of the new concomitant deviation. Two important factors has to be considered for making a decision of the surgical plan. First is the amount of the residual muscle function that is present in the parotid muscle, and second, in which direction of the gaze the deviation is greatest. Supposingly the paralyzed muscle has achieved good to moderate function, then depending whether in which deviation in which gaze the deviation is maximum. If it is in antagonist gaze, we weaken the antagonist. If it is towards the gaze of the involved muscle, we weaken the yoke muscle along with strengthening of the parotid muscle. In cases where the muscle has not gained good function and the basic management is to strengthen that side of the muscle by transposition, and better is to weaken the yoke muscle. So what we do, we
The
weaken the
times of,
unopposed antagonistic. Yes, I finished. We weaken the antagonist by recession, Botox or myotomy, strengthen by resection, plication or transposition. Just I wanted to share one pearl. Don't weaken the antagonist in the parotid muscle which are poorly functioning. This creates a very small binocular field, and because the eye is not moving in either direction. Adjustable surgeries has to be done in cases to achieve optimal result. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neelu, for a wonderful presentation. I think we can take a few questions later on because all the topics are related. So perhaps if there are any questions from the chat box, we can take it in due course of time. I take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Shubhangi Bhave, madam. I think she doesn't need any introduction as such in the forum of Squint and Pediatric Ophthalm. She is practicing pediatric ophthalmology since last 37 years. She is an alumnus of GMC Nagpur and a recognized postgraduate teacher at Nagpur University. She has been the president of Nagpur Academy of Ophthalmology, Vidarbha Ophthalmic Society, and she is a scientific committee chairman of BOS and a life member of many other societies. She is also organizing chairman of MOSCON, the state conference which was done here physically, the last physical conference we had 2 years back, and she is practicing at Drushti Eye Clinic and Squint Center since 1994. With this, I invite Dr. Bhave madam for her talk on third nerve palsy.
Thank you, Rishi, for that wonderful introduction. Just a minute. I think I just, while checking, I didn't bring it to the... Neelu spoke very well on the broad principles and made our ideas clear about the how we should deal with broadly in paralytic squint. Now we will be discussing each nerve. I'll be speaking on management of third nerve. So we arrive at a clinical diagnosis. The definite diagnosis is by appropriate investigations. Neuroimaging, not strictly necessary in ischemic palsies, but if you are following up a case as an ischemic palsy and then the patient develops aberrant reinnervation, then imaging is must. Acute palsy, we wait and watch, except in compressive lesions, surgical management, if there's no improvement, for 6 months. Surgery in cases of third nerve palsy is a challenge to every ophthalmologist. Achieving parallelism in the primary position, what could be achieved at most, depending on the deviation and ocular movements, we plan the surgical procedures. In partial palsies, supramaximal recession of LR with the resection or plication of MR and might work. Operation on non-involved eye can be used to create a fixation duress and help in correcting exotropias and hypotropia according to the Shering's law, as has been nicely explained by Divya. So we'll take the mainstay of treatment till now in third nerve palsy was superior oblique tendon transfer, which is done in total third nerve palsy. because we have only two muscles which are active, that is lateral rectus and superior oblique. Superior oblique is disinserted and released from the trochlea and then sutured above the medial rectus after keeping the slight in adduction. And this is, of course, done along with the supramaximal recession of lateral rectus. Trochlear fracture is nowadays not recommended. Now, this is a case which showed a right ptosis, right exotropia with hypotropia. The secondary deviation is obviously more than the primary deviation, which you can see, and a right adduction, elevation and depression deficit is present. This case, we did a supramaximal recession of right lateral rectus with transposition of right superior oblique to right medial rectus. We could achieve a good result in the primary position, though the ptosis remained and there was a decreased adduction, elevation, and depression. In cases of complete third nerve palsy, the periosteal anchoring of the medial rectus, or as we say, the anchoring of the globe to the periosteum, is a procedure which gives a desirable result. Here, this procedure fixates the eye at a desired position with the help of non-absorbable suture between medial rectus and anterolacrimal crest via DCR-like incision, and this is combined with a supramaximal recession of LR. Now, this is a case of a complete third nerve palsy, as you can see, following a road traffic accident. He had a right-sided severe ptosis with a large angle exotropia of more than 80 prism diopters. Left exotropia was much more. All the movements in right eye were restricted except abduction. Bell's was absent. So we did this procedure. As you can see, the DCR-like incision is made and a non-absorbable suture is taken from the ligament, anterior lacrimal ligament there near the crest, lacrimal crest. And after taking the suture, it is brought out into the orbit above the medial rectus muscle. Slightly older video, so it's not very clear, but tells us the steps which are required. And after the needle is brought out in front of the medial rectus, the suture is tied to the sclera in front of the medial rectus. After keeping the eye somewhat in adduction, this is how the suture is tied. This is the post-op result showing significant correction of exotropia, but since he had a severe ptosis with absent Bell's, we had to give him an crutch spectacles. Now, this was another case, a 37-year-old male with a deviation of left eye outward drooping since birth. He had a severe ptosis with Marcus gun phenomena. Bell's was defective, but he had an element of pseudotosis, which is seen in many of the patients. See, when he's fixating with his left eye, the ptosis is very less. So, in order to take care of this, these are the pre-op photos. He had an 45 to 50 prism diopters of exo with 35 prism diopters of hypo, and there was a depression of adduction, elevation, and depression. And this, we did a lateral rectus recession on the right eye with superrectus recession, and left eye lateral rectus recession of 9 millimeters with plication of 6 millimeters, and inferior rectus recession of 6 millimeters, which significantly corrected his exotropia and hypotropia. And this is the video which is showing correction of exotropia and hypotropia. But we couldn't correct the ptosis very well. Probably we should have done more amount of superior rectus recession. Then the Y-split and medial transposition of LR introduced by Taylor and then Kaufman. In Gokikit's modification, the split tendon is passed beneath the SRS and SO superiorly, inferior rectus and IO inferiorly, and tied 1 millimeter posterior to the upper and lower border of medial rectus. And I'll just show this case. She had an traumatic third nerve palsy on the right side, and in brief, this is the procedure. I don't know, we might have to stop the video in between. This is how the split nasal transposition of LR is done to MR. She had a very, very tight LR, as you can see in this video. Sorry. I was trying to push the video forwards. Yes, basically after making 2 slips of the superior rectus, see how free the eye is after this. And then the slips are brought out beneath the inferior oblique and inferior rectus muscle. We can even cut the oblique and inferior superior oblique muscle so that it makes it easier for us to see. This is how the inferior slip is brought. And then just a minute, I'll just finish this. And this is the medial rectus, and they are brought to the posterior border and superior border of the medial rectus and tied, can be tied on adjustable also. Okay, so just a last, though in this patient we didn't get a very good result, probably because the muscle was very tight, and probably we should have done a larger of the lateral rectus muscle. And then we did a periosteal fixation of a LR, and the result was better. And thanks for a patient listening. I'll stop sharing now. Varsha,
Yes.
start you.
First, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank Bhave Madam and Scientific Committee MOS for giving the opportunity.
Share screen.
Yes.
Share your screen.
Yes, ma'am. Is it visible, madam?
No,
Is it visible?
no, no.
नहीं visible नहीं.
Varsha, can Rishi
Just a minute, madam. Yes, madam, he can start.
I think you just sort it out. Till open the presentation on your laptop, and then I think Rishi, you can start your talk so that we can take Varsha's after that.
Okay, just a minute.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, can we take, ma'am, some questions?
Yeah, if there are any questions in the chat box. Yes, Neelu, you have anything in mind? Rishi, are you ready?
Karun Pahukar, madam. Karun
तो माझं
Pahukar.
आहे म्हणजे मला हा करून पाहता का
करून पहा.
मला फक्त शेअर स्क्रीनचा ऑप्शन आला नाहीये.
Is it visible, madam?
Yes, yes.
हा now it is visible.
Make
Yes,
it
yes.
screen.
He
Full screen खाली असतं ते.
Oh. Is it full screen now?
Yes, yes. Yes.
Yes, sorry for the delay. I would like to discuss the fourth nerve palsy case-based approach. Fourth nerve, as we all know, it supplies superior oblique with action of that is the longest muscle with action of intorsion, depression, and adduction. Fourth nerve palsy is a common ocular motility defect. It can be unilateral, bilateral, and may be masked bilateral, and one must be aware of that, which is seen in again at around 10% of cases. It can be congenital or acquired, and this differentiation is also very important because congenital squint, well compensated, may get suddenly decompensated due to fever, injury, and patient may present as diplopia and confuse as recent onset. And so in such cases, unnecessary tests can be avoided, whereas in acquired squint, neurological and medical investigations, as already discussed, are mandatory. This difference between congenital and acquired already discussed, but most important thing I would like to just emphasize, the facial asymmetry one should not miss, and the ocular torticollis, which is in long-standing cases doesn't disappear on closure of one eye, whereas in acquired palsy, it disappears if the one eye is closed. So the presentation of superior oblique palsy is with vertical and torsional diplopia. There is abnormal head posture, head tilt to opposite shoulder, and there is concomitant hypertropia, a pattern strabismus. It could be mild, as you see in this case. There is hypertropia in down and adduction. In moderate case, there is hypertropia in adduction, and in severe case, there is hypertropia in primary position. So that way we can grade the superior oblique palsy. In coming to the principles of management, in congenital palsy, management depends at what age the patient presents, what are his complaints, and surgery is indicated only if there is abnormal head posture, diplopia, and hypertropia. Basic principle is weakening of inferior oblique or straightening of superior oblique. There is a NAPS classification is a very good guideline for deciding which muscle to tackle. Along with that, sometimes we need to do ipsilateral superior rectus recession or other contralateral inferior rectus recession surgery along with horizontal muscle surgery, depending on the type of squint is necessary. So this is a 5-year-old female with a slight head tilt to right shoulder with chin depression. There's V esotropia with alternating hypertropia. And on Parkes step test, there is a confirmed bilateral superior oblique palsy. On undoing her head posture, we can see a large esotropia with a hypertropia. So these are her 9-gaze photographs with inferior oblique overaction 3+ and bilateral superior oblique underaction. So in this case, in the plan of action is inferior oblique recession with anterior positioning with medial rectus recession. And one must remember that preoperative attention to exaggerated post-duction test is very important to rule out the tendon laxity. And that this procedure corrected her abnormal head posture, torticollis, and hypertropia. This is an 18-year-old boy, asymptomatic up till now, came with the complaints of intermittent vertical diplopia after high-grade viral history of high-grade viral fever, headache, and eye strain. And examination, he had head tilt to right shoulder with facial asymmetry. There is hypertropia of about 10 PD, increasing in the right gaze and on tilt to the left side. So the Parkes 3 test was positive for this patient, and inferior oblique overaction was of grade 2. So the old photographs and the facial asymmetry gave the clue that it was a congenital esopalsy decompensated after fever, giving the symptoms of esthenopia. So this is a short video. In this case, he needs surgical correction for diplopia as there was no relief with the glasses. So this is a inferior oblique Parkes recession, inferior oblique isolated, disinserted, and then secured with the 60 Vicryl. And I've taken videos from Bhave madam. Thanks for sharing, madam. And then it was resutured after securing with 60 Vicryl. This is inferior rectus hooked and 2 mm lateral and 3 mm below the lateral border of inferior rectus. The muscle was sutured. So this procedure corrected his hypertropia. Slight head tilt was improved, but because it was old, total torticollis could not be. But he was symptoms free, and his diplopia was disappeared. This is again a 39-year-old male with complaints of eye strain, vertical diplopia, and especially while playing badminton recently. And he was nearing presbyopic age, so he came for refraction. but he never noticed abnormal head posture, facial asymmetry before, and there was no relief with the glasses. On examination, he had right hypertrophy of 20 PD, excyclorotation of 8 degrees, and 3+3 inferior oblique overaction. And again, in this case, also old photos confirm that was a congenital and now decompensated, giving him asthenopia during his presbyopic age. So these are his 9-gaze photograph. Definitely, the treatment Parkes 3 test also confirm the diagnosis. Hair screen, diplopia charting, already discussed by Dr. Neelu. So definite surgery is to relieve his symptoms. Inferior oblique recession with total anterior positioning was done. Entire width of inferior oblique was reinserted into the anterior to the inferior rectus. In this case, again, head posture did not improve because of the permanent torticollis, but he was comfortable in all gazes as fusion improved. And another indications of surgery in superior oblique is when the tendon is very lax. This patient had exaggerated FDT showed that their superior oblique is lax, and so superior oblique tuck was done in this case. Here only inferior oblique overaction is very minimal or absent, and maximum gaze involvement is in depression. So this is a small video of superior oblique tuck where the superior oblique is isolated and then hooked. And then with a after total separation, 4 mm on either side, that will give you around 8 mm effect of tucking with a 5-0 ETH bond, non-absorbable suture. The sutures are given, and then the so this improves the strengthening. This has a strengthening effect in the down gaze, and one should not miss this laxity of the muscle, otherwise you may not get appropriate symptoms pre-patient. Then this photograph of the patient showing comfortable down depression gaze. Then this 48-year-old man came for refraction without any symptoms. It was diagnosed in routine eye checkup, well compensated. So such patients don't need any treatment or surgery. So I would like to just emphasize that congenital cases may present at any age. So depending on the presentation and complaints, we have to decide the plan of action. Then a word about Harada-Ito. This is procedure is done only to strengthen intorsion. And again, acquired palsy already been discussed. In such cases, there is sudden onset diplopia, and we have to investigate these patients to rule out the cause, post-head injury or post-viral fever. So the neurological assessment is important. During follow-up, you have to look main emphasis on his chart to know the see the contractures, and if surgery decision is crucial before contractures develop. So follow-up is important in cases of acquired palsies. And depending on the etiology, prisms, patch and surgery, and exaggerated FDT, again very important to rule out lax muscle. So coming to the conclusion that decision making is crucial at every step of management of fourth nerve palsy. Congenital esopalsy cases can present at any age, but decision depends on the symptoms of presentation. Acquired palsies, proper investigations, regular follow-up is essential to decide the timing and procedure of surgery. So superior oblique surgery properly done is safe, effective, and yields results that cannot be achieved by any other method. So one has to be very careful in doing this surgery to have good results. Thank you. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you, Varsha, for a very nice presentation on oblique muscle fourth nerve palsy. Can you start sharing?
Yes, madam. Yes.
So, Rishi, go in with your presentation, and then if we have time, we will discuss some. Neelu, if you have some queries, please keep it ready.
My screen is visible?
Yes, yes, make it full screen.
Yeah, just a minute. So, shall I start, or want to take up a question?
Start.
Okay. Okay. So at the side, I would like to thank Dr. Bhavi Madam to make me a part of this particular instruction course, and MOS for giving us an opportunity to share our views about paralytic strabismus. We have, I think, almost extensively covered most of the topics. So I will be just discussing the salient features which perhaps might have been missed in sixth nerve palsy. Sixth nerve palsy is actually the commonest paralytic strabismus, and among them, the most common cause is ischemic or something related to diabetes or hypertension, which happens in elderly age group. In younger age group, trauma can be a cause of it, or in younger children, post-viral infection or vaccination can present with sixth nerve palsy, but usually it recovers with time. In middle-aged ladies, if sixth nerve palsy is present, it can be a false localizing sign associated with raised intracranial pressure, which might be a benign intracranial hypertension or a space-occupying lesion. Congenital sixth nerve palsy is not that common compared to fourth nerve palsy, as Varsha Pandey Madam just mentioned. The salient features or the most important feature is patient will have a sudden onset diplopia and abduction limitation. But this is not the only cause for it, and there are many other cases where sixth nerve palsy or apart from sixth nerve palsy, you can get these presenting features, which I'll be showing just now. In addition to that, the patient has a face turn on the side of the affected muscle, and usually, if depending upon which eye is being used for fixation, the esotropia will vary. If the normal eye is being used, it will be a small angle iso. But if sometimes, for some reasons, the patient has starts using the paretic eye, then you get a secondary deviation, in which case the iso will be larger. Always look for the palpebral fissure changes. As in this patient, he had this squint entity since early childhood. He had abduction limitation, but as you can see, on attempted adduction in the left eye, he has an upshoot, and there is narrowing of the palpebral fissure, as very well seen. And he had abduction limitation, which is one of the most commonest mistake done. This is not sixth nerve palsy. This is the case of a Duane syndrome. Usually Duane syndrome patient doesn't have diplopia and they have palpebral fissure changes, and it is there since early childhood. Sometimes you will get a large angle squint, as in this child, since early childhood, and they also tend to have abduction limitation. It's not abduction limitation as such. It is basically cross fixation which the child develops in order to counter the loss of stereopsis or binocular vision. It's a case of an infantile esotropia and not a sixth nerve palsy. This needs early surgery. Coming to the other squint entity, which might mimic a sixth nerve palsy, as in this girl, she had a sudden onset squint, and she also had a diplopia. She had esotropia, as usually seen in sixth nerve palsy, but the ocular movement is full. This indicates that it's a comitant esotropia. It's not an incomitant esotropia. There exists an entity called acute comitant esotropia, which she had, and I mean, this can also mimic like a sixth nerve palsy. So coming to the sixth nerve palsy cases, I will just show you how to go start about it in diagnosis and then the further management. This patient had a sudden onset binocular diplopia, face turned to the left side, as you can see very well. And when we force him to use the left eye for fixation, the amount of ESO is much more. This is secondary deviation compared to the primary when the right eye is being fixated. So this is basically a case of a sixth nerve palsy. Without doing ocular motility itself, you can realize that perhaps this is a paretic squint. Coming to another patient, he had a trauma. A gate fell on his head, a poor child actually. And you can see that on attempted right eye fixation, the amount of ESO is much more. He also had a facial nerve palsy in the left side. And you can see that the ESO is much more in the right eye when the right eye is being fixated compared to when he is using the left eye for fixation. The ocular movement also shows abduction limitation, as you can see now. There is hardly any abduction in the right eye. So this is a case of a sixth nerve palsy, a traumatic. Coming to one case, an interesting case of a 64-year-old male who had diabetes and a sudden onset horizontal binocular diplopia since 1 week, and he had a poor glycemic control. Around 369 was his sugar when he presented to me. He had been operated for the right for cataract, so that's why his vision in the right eye was better than the left eye. Binocularly, you can see that he has a left esotropia. The eye which is squinting does not necessarily be the paretic eye. Remember this. So basically, because the vision in the right eye was better, this is what you see is the secondary deviation. Because on abduction, he had mild abduction limitation in the right eye, and diplopia charting definitely reveals that on attempted abduction in the right eye, the diplopia increases, or right gaze the diplopia increases, which is also what you get in orthoptic evaluation. So basically for sixth nerve palsy, you don't need to assume things because sometimes it might be different than what you can actually get. So because he wanted rapid relief from the diplopia, he was a consultant to a software company. We decided to go ahead and give Botox. Usually I don't give more than 3.5 to 4 units of Botox. It can be given under visualization, which ensures that it goes into the desired tissue. It is more like doing a surgery itself. But the advantage of Botox is that it is temporary, and in case of ischemic sixth nerve palsy, usually the recovery, they anyway recover, but you get a diplopia-free interval earlier than what it would have been otherwise. Also, it helps in reducing the contracture of the medial rectus. Botox can also be given using a superior rectus forceps, as in this child who had a traumatic sixth nerve palsy in the left eye. We used a superior rectus forceps, and under sedation, we had anesthetist with us, and I injected around 2.5 to 3 units. Botox doesn't have a cumulative effect. If it doesn't mean that 20 units, 20 prism diopter of ISO will need less Botox and 40 will need more. It is not like that. Usually, you don't give more than 5 units at a time. So this was for this particular patient that the esotropia increased. Just the last case, a 52-year-old female who had diabetes and a sudden onset horizontal diplopia. She had a left face turn. So we will assume that probably this is sixth nerve palsy. Left face turn means left-sided patient, sixth nerve palsy, and probably diabetes is the cause. It is a sixth nerve palsy, obviously, but don't assume things, as I told you. You need to do a complete evaluation, including fundus, because sometimes you might get this. So she had a post-papilledemic optic atrophy. And again, don't assume that it being a middle-aged lady, it might be perhaps a false localizing sign because of raised intracranial pressure. Go ahead and do an imaging, because sometimes the imaging might show something else. Like in this case, it was a case of acoustic neuroma. CP angle tumors are the commonest in space-occupying lesion causing a sixth nerve palsy. So to conclude, sixth nerve palsy should be suspected in all cases of sudden onset horizontal diplopia. You have to individualize case, take a thorough clear history and clinical examination, and that will help in deciding the diagnosis and management plan. The treatment is case-based. Every case is different, and you have to decide the treatment based upon an individual case. And always try to maintain, the aim should be diplopia-free field in the primary gaze and down gazes. It may not be possible in all the gazes. So the aim of our instruction course is to provide a diplopia-free world to all our patients. Thank you.
Very well presented, Rishi. I think you should have just added the surgical part to the management, but the transposition or the naps or whatever we do. Any questions? Do we see anything in the chat box?
For sixth nerve palsy, madam, for mild cases, we can do a recess reset. We didn't used to do it, but even for paretic muscle, we can do a resection for the sixth nerve palsy, just like for a routine case. Except if it is very severe, then we can do a transposition of the superior rectus and inferior rectus along the lateral rectus. That can be added.
So if the fourth generation test, you should do a fourth generation test. If there is a tuck, when we feel in the lateral rectus, then we can do an resection and recession of recession procedure in sixth nerve palsy. So FGT is important in deciding whether there is any force left in the lateral rectus muscle.
Yes, ma'am. Like what we have discussed, the two fundamental points that will help us in decision making is the power the paralytic muscle that has gained, whether it is moderate or good, or it has very minimally or not at all recovered.
Yes.
And also the gaze in which the deviation is more.
Yes.
So if it is towards the side of the antagonist, it is better to release the antagonist. But if it is more towards the side of the paratic muscle, we have to balance the weakness with the yoke muscle. This is because if we keep on recessing the antagonist along with resecting, we will, whatever the opposite side of diplopia free field is there, that is also will create incompetence. So depending in which gaze it is, we should plan accordingly those two muscles or three muscles.
If it is a
question,
paresis, if it is a mild paresis of lateral rectus, then and primary position, if there is no ESO deviation, no significant, you can even get away with just applying Faden to the contralateral medial rectus. I've done
Yes.
it in a patient where she had only an ESO deviation in the affected side, that is the left side. She had a mild left lateral paresis, and esotropia was only in the left gaze, and primary position she was almost diplopia free, but even that gaze was disturbing her. So the recession of the medial
Imagine this
rectus
good.
would have caused an exotropia in the primary position. So I went ahead and did a Faden to her right medial rectus, which reduced the esophoria in the left gaze. So even that works. It is basically when the paralysis is very large, then it is easier to manage. But when it is very less,
For actually, the
Yes.
smaller angles are much more bothersome, especially in
Yes.
small diplopia and primary gaze. So
you have to put
it
on your
can be.
thinking cap more in
Yeah.
cases of small angles than when the angles are very large.
And maybe the patient are also psychologically well prepared that perhaps the complete relief from this condition may not be possible, especially if the angles are very large.
Very
So we have to balance it. But many of the cases are actually milder forms of sixth nerve palsy, and many of them are ischemic, so they usually recover with time. So you have to provide the diplopia free period earlier for them. So that's it.
Any other question? Yeah.
Rishi sir, any tips to avoid the spillage of the Botox?
There are,
While
I have shown only
injecting,
two
like,
ways. When you are injecting under visualization, the 2 points only. After injecting, just keep the needle there for some time, because that the passage of the needle also the drug can spill over. And after removing the needle, immediately you put a cotton tipped applicator so that the drug remains into the muscle belly for a longer period of time. If you are doing it with a superior rectus forceps, then after injecting, hold the needle there for say around 10 to 15 seconds so that the drug doesn't spill over. Spill over the drug results into ptosis. That is the most common complication you might actually encounter with. And try to put it into the belly, not into the tendon.
Do you have any experience in using it for obliques? Because they have mentioned in
No.
superior oblique palsy.
No,
What
I have
of
never
inferior oblique?
I have not
This is
used
one of the treatment mentioned.
To make one point for the fixation duress in a third nerve palsy, especially when they have a pseudotosis because of large hypotropia, as I had shown in that case. But I did small amounts of superrectus recession. It is described that we do up to 8 to 10 millimeters or even 12 millimeters of recession in uninvolved eye, so that we don't allow that eye to go up, and that will create a fixation duress, and which will make him
Reduce the ptosis in the other eye.
ptosis in the involved.
Involved.
So that is what we can even do an inferior rectus resection along with superrectus recession in the uninvolved eye.
Can
It's
we
about
take one
time.
more question?
No, I think it's the time is 12 o'clock. So
Yes.
Okay.
I thank all my speakers for actively participating in this workshop. Everyone spoke very well, and thank MOS for giving us an opportunity to do this IC. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone.
thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, ma'am.